welcome to our very first event in our speaker series put on by the Center for Feminist Research this year. My name is Neetu Khanna, for those of you who don't know me. But before I introduce our very fabulous speaker today, I wanted to just give you a few highlights of some of the things that are going on this year through the Center for Feminist Research. So our speaker series this fall centers on recently published books in feminist research that theorize questions of sex and sexuality by authors largely writing from the global south. So this is something that Anjali's work is going to undoubtedly frame and productively trouble for us throughout the semester. Coming up in November, our next speaker is film scholar Darshana Mini, who will talk to us about her new book on the softcore porn industry in India. In December, we will host Ivan Ramos and Hentai Yap in conversation, who both work in queer performance studies and aesthetic theory. Ivan writes on all kinds of Mexican Latinx art forms, but particularly focusing on punk and metal rock scenes, and Hentai writes on Chinese performance art and art markets, and both of them are really just exquisite readers of art and art worlds. In the spring, our speaker series will focus on feminist research that center on what we might call questions of political disappointment, the politics of disaffection, Afro-pessimisms, political pessimisms, and so on. So we're going to be hosting Sarah Marcus, who's written a book on political disappointment in the US, from Reconstruction to the AIDS crisis. We will also welcome two post-colonial feminist scholars, Angela Naimu, who works on Palestine, Palestinian literature, and Sonali Pereira, who works on working class literatures in Sri Lanka, and they're actually co-writing a book together on post-colonial debt and indebtedness that I'm pretty obsessed with these days, so I'm very excited about their visit as well. And so these are just a few highlights, lots of things going on, so make sure you're on our mailing list if you're not already. Check out our webpage and our Insta, all that. Okay, so now that that's over with, I just want to introduce today's speaker. Anjali Arondekar is Peggy and Jack Baskin Foundation Presidential Professor of Feminist Studies and the founding director of the Center for South Asian Studies at University of California, Santa Cruz. She's the author of For the Record on Sexuality in the Colonial Archive in India, which came out with Duke University Press in 2009, Orient Black Swan in India in 2010. For the Record was the winner of the MLA Alan Brand Memorial Book Award for Best Book in Lesbian, Gay, or Queer Studies, no biggie. Her research engages the comparative poetics and politics of sexuality, caste, and historiography, with a focus on Indian Ocean studies in South Asia. She's here today to talk about her magnificent second book, Abundance, Sexuality's History, which came out with Duke University Press and Orient Black Swan in 2023. Hot off the press. We are so excited to have you here. Thank you, Anjali.
Thanks, Neetu. Thanks, Neetu, for that wonderful introduction. I have learned so much from Neetu's work. So when she asked me to do this, I'm here just to be with her. So the rest of you are just a happy bonus. Before I begin, I want to, of course, thank Neetu, but also Colton, where are you, for taking very good care of me, and for all of you for surviving the earthquake this morning, and thank God the sweltering heat is gone. It affects my wardrobe, and as a homosexual, those things are very important for us. So now, Jai Bhim to all of you. Jai Bhim is a celebration and invocation that those of us who are caste-oppressed say when we begin, and I know some of you are not familiar, so I just wanted to indicate why I'm saying that. Now, before I begin, I want to acknowledge, as we must, that we are on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielana Tongva peoples who live, work, produce knowledge on and nurture the land where USC is now located. I also want to remind us, as queer indigenous scholars have done more recently, that an acknowledgement is not the same as a relationship. It would thus be remiss not to acknowledge that we also stand witness to the theft and destruction of Palestinian lands in this time of ongoing genocide. Today, as a feminist scholar of South Asia and the Global South, I stand in solidarity with our female and fellow educators in occupied Palestine who have renewed their call for international academic institutions to stand with Palestinian people. To fail to do so would be an abdication of scholarly and ethical responsibility. So my meditation today is dedicated to two comrades persecuted for their commitment to a scholarship of dissent. Omar Khalid, a student activist and research scholar from Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, who has been in jail since 2020, and the Palestinian feminist intellectual Nadira Shalub-Kevorkian from Hebrew University, who was detained twice and has recently been forced to resign for speaking out against state regimes of violence. I know we need no reminders, but we must always stay present. So with that brief acknowledgement, let me begin. I'm going to wander around and make sure you're awake instead of standing behind the podium. It makes the performance of reading a little bit more relaxing. So we'll get to the dirty pictures anon, but for now, I am your scene of action. I am not your data, nor am I your vote bank. I am not your project or any exotic museum object. I am not the soul waiting to be harvested, nor I am the lab where your theories are tested. I am not your field, your crowd, your history, your help, your guilt, medallions of your victory. So I draw my own picture and invent my own grammar. I make my own tools to fight my own battle for me, my people, my world, and my Adhivasi self. Abhay Khaka. So writes Abhay Khaka, an Adivasi scholar, activist, artist, in an excerpt from a longer poem entitled, I Am Not Your Data, in what remains one of the most militant and poignant tracks of anti-caste aestheticism and politics. Khaka, a member of the Kurukh community, born and brought up in Jashpur district, Chhattisgarh, India, died tragically of a heart attack in March 2020. I had the privilege of working and knowing Khaka for many years. A stalwart of Adivasi land reform, Khaka was first and foremost an intellectual who pushed for radical imaginaries that would combat the datification and dehumanization of his Adivasi and Dalit Bahujan kin. If one motif hums through his poem, it is the pressing, almost unbearable awareness of the privations of caste and the unction of history. As if to say, between who we are and how we are seen lies an unbridgeable matrix, an archive of algorithmic violence that won't let us breathe. So I draw my own picture and invent my own grammar. He writes in his limpid litany of refusals, exhorting us, his readers, to imagine vibrant historical vernaculars for Adivasi and Dalit Bahujan presence. Just a short aside, I use the terms Adivasi instead of the term tribal or scheduled tribes or scheduled castes because it's the preferred term by the collectivities who represent that. I use the term Dalit instead of the ghastly term invented by Gandhi, untouchable or scheduled castes, because that is a term of liberation used by caste-oppressed communities. I use Bahujan instead of other backward castes, which is again a nominalization that is given by the state, right? So I will return to those with just a small gloss in case you're wondering what they reference. So for the past decade or so, I have returned often to Khaka's trenchant exhortation to think through my own intellectual discomfort with the evidentiary regimes that secure pathways to histories of caste, descent, and sexuality. To think about what it means to not be data or fodder for a knowledge supply chain that sees minoritized histories only through lineage of loss, erasure, and paucity. I recently wrote a book, which some of you, I think, have read, Abundance, Sexuality's History. It was in equal measure a diatribe, an exegesis, a theoretical meditation, and a historiographical experiment against the archival demands placed on minoritized histories and the scripted mandates of evidence, geopolitics, and verification, a sort of refusal of the show and tell historical method that requires archival erasure before it can imagine presence. The wager for me then and now was that caste and sexuality were the interlude, the descent within the historical record that would wean us away from our imaginaries of data gathering and systems of verification. I turned instead to the concept metaphor of abundance as a heuristic to advance a non-recuperative history that embraces presence without return or the fear of loss. I'll say more about it when we get to the archival images I'll show you, but this is sort of giving you the broader canvas of my questions. My turn to abundance appears less as a seductive alternative to the evidentiary mandates of datafied histories of caste or sexuality. Rather, it gestures more to the shifting demands of such a history, iterating and circumventing its ubiquitous claims at the same time. As I have repeatedly argued now for over 2 decades, we have afforded lavish attention to the effacement of minoritized histories and somehow left their efflorescence woefully under-theorized. A history of sexuality full of joyous indiscretions and staged archives, shaped and determined by caste oppression, remains untold. To summon a history of abundance, I want to suggest then, is not to be restored to representation under continuing occupation, but to be set adrift upon more intrepid economies of meaning, sometimes harmonious, sometimes dissonant, that come together to upend genealogies of historical recuperation and representation. Perhaps such abundance leaves us inarticulate, or we are daunted by the weight of its promise. It might be time to heed the call and set our subjects free. Now today, as we stand witness to an unimaginable genocide of our Palestinian kin, such archival habits of show and tell, prove that we exist, seem even more pressing and perhaps impossible to leave behind. As my comrade and friend Ariella Azoulay reminds us so eloquently, to recuperate archives of Palestinian lives without theorizing our habits of representation is to reify, quote, the morality of members of colonizing societies and not the morality of the colonized, the racialized, the terrorized, the oppressed. If the colonial injunction of morality is to look, she asks us, the anti-colonial one is to look for the truth. How then, I want to suggest, do we invent an archival grammar of dissent? To return to my open epigraph by Kaka, to refuse metonymic deployment, to do more than to witness, to become and indeed inhabit a different order of archival presence. How do we move from keeping the story alive to keeping the subject alive? I just finished an essay which is called Keeping the Subject Alive, which is about how do we archive Palestine, and I'm happy to say more about it anon. Now, on offer today, because we are doing a quick drive-by, are 3 historical snippets of what I will call Andolan, dissent imaginaries, meditations that move between the heady inspiration of current protests and the stultifying violence of state practices. Andolan, as some of you here know, is a movement in Hindustani music, an alankar, a combination ornamentation of notes, to be specific, that oscillates between one fixed note and its counterpart, touching, suffusing all that lies in between. Now I'm going to walk you through some of the images to give you a glimpse of the archives I'm thinking from, so that if you have not had a chance to glance at the book, you will have some sense of what I'm talking about. Now, I'd like you to keep this image of the cover in mind, not because it's a beautiful cover, but because we will return to it anon. Now, through my research on the Dalit Bahujan, remember Dalit Bahujan are terms that caste-oppressed communities use as forms of self-identification. Through my research on a Dalit Bahujan devadasi community, I'll explain that term, the Gomantak Maratha Samaj, I have encountered Andolan archives of invention, thriving ecosystems of dissent, refusal, and pleasure. The Gomantak Maratha Samaj, I'll just refer to it as a Samaj, is a historical anomaly and rarity, both in its archival forms and content. Now, I'm absolutely not a fan of colonial maps, but even South Asians often forget that India was colonized by the Portuguese. This is a dreadful map from the 19th century of the Bombay Presidency, and the place I'm talking about is like a little pimple right there, which is Goa, which was colonized by the Portuguese for over 250 years, till 1961. And the collectivity that I'm talking about comes from that place and traverses and crosses into British and Portuguese India. So I want you to imagine that map because of the enduring presence of competing empires within a South-South framework, right? So maps are unreliable, but they're also good sort of trailers for what we should and shouldn't do. So the Gomantak Maratha Samaj is a historical anomaly and rarity, both in its archival forms and content. And we'll get to this image in a bit. First, let me tell you a little bit about the Samaj. The Samaj is a prominent lower caste devadasi collectivity hailing from colonial Portuguese and British India. Devadasi, again, as some of you know, is a Sanskrit term literally meaning a slave, dasi, of a god master, often falsely seen as interchangeable with terms such as courtesan, sex worker, prostitute. Gomantak refers to the geographical roots in Goa. Maratha is both a caste and regional term, and Samaj refers both to collectivity, society, and or community. Now, as I mentioned, moving between British and Portuguese India spread across the border states of Maharashtra, Goa, and Karnataka. These are three states in Western India. The Samaj is the only Devadasi community. Remember, Devadasi means slaves of God, could also mean courtesan, sex worker, has over 50,000 registered members, and counterintuitively has maintained its own continuous archive since its inception in 1927 till today, embracing rather than disavowing its history of caste and sexuality. So that's the rarity and the anomaly, right? We have a subaltern archive that has never disappeared, that has never been erased, and has constituted its own narration of itself. Now, its archives, before we get to its archives, let me just talk a little bit about these images. So before I get to the Samaj archives, I want you to look at this image, which is not in the book. These are the more conventional colonial typological images, like the ethnographic showcases that we see of this community. Now, are any Portuguese speakers here? That's a very standard Portuguese magazine that comes out. This archive is in Lisboa in Lisbon, and it has an image of a woman from this community, a bailadeira, or a dancing girl, and she is very recognizably looking away. Any of you who work in visual vernaculars recognize the way the image is staged. It's very beautiful, it is framed in a certain way, very familiar, right? Keep in mind these images, because this is one of the few representations that we see of these collectivities, which are all addressed in this sort of canonical ethnographic showcase way. This is again another standard example of a Portuguese, and you can see uma bailadeira right in the middle, again an image of an official archive representation, right? Again, I want you to keep these in mind before we turn to the archives of the collectivity. Now we'll get to the archives of the collectivity. So the archives of this Samaj, as I said, have been around since the late 19th century, embracing rather than disavowing the history of sexuality. The archives in Mumbai and Panji, Mumbai formerly known as Bombay, Panji, which is the capital of Goa, are accessible and available to all that care to enter. This is radically counterintuitive prospect for anyone who's ever done research in India or anywhere in the global south. And full of the minutiae of subaltern life, an efflorescent and heady melange of fact and fiction with archival genres that corrupt and stage verifiability in the form of fake birth records, property deeds, and more. A canny archival pragmatism founds these collections, where the sheer abundance of materials is less an organizing than a disorganizing force, shot through by questions of pleasure, practice, and subjectivity and ethics. Within these archives, we encounter evidentiary genres of invention and sustenance. Now, I'm going to talk you through those archives so that you understand what I'm trying to say. Now, I worked on this book for over 10 years, or maybe almost 15 years, I would say, and I read about 60% of the material. So there is, and I'll say more about why that does not gesture to a plenitude of materials, but something else. But now, let me just give you a little bit of a glance of the archive. So this is, there are people here who read Devanagari. This is a very standard constitution, first page of the Samaj, right? Because in order for it to be recognized as an archive, it must have the stylizations of an official archive, right? Just like if you have a literary magazine, you have to have letters to the editor, you have to have certain genres that make it legible as something, right? So that's why there's a canny pragmatism. So in these archives, you have these, this is the constitution, but you see it's rather random. It says Thapana 1927, and then there's a random quotation by Tennyson, which is just there for no rhyme or reason, right? But it has a status of a genre, and the Constitution is long and tortured. This is pages of the Constitution which have things from dress code to don't stamp your foot to how you should sit to how you should speak. So it's a range of detail and minutiae. Again, a constitution and archive for what we will think about together. This is a registration of certificate, which tells you that it was officially. The reason why I'm giving you these examples is to say that this is not hard to find, right? Anybody here, you don't even have to speak Marathi or Hindi or Konkani. You can go into these archives and look at these materials, but yet nobody has looked at them because our relationship to subalternity is always one of erasure and paucity and inaccessibility, right? So when something is accessible, available, and full of its own invention, it seems messier and harder to engage with and doesn't give us the redemption of an oppositional politics, which requires the origin story of loss, right? And that's why I'm showing you these things. Now, remember that first image we saw of the staged woman from the Portuguese archive. These are not images that are in the book. That's why I tried to find other ones. This is a calling card, right? Because these women were also sex workers. So at the bottom it says rendezvous, right? So in the archive you find a lot. These are from photographic studios in Bombay. You find a lot of these calling cards that the women handed out in order to procure patrons, yajmans. This is a very different image from the one you saw. This woman is almost bored. And if you look at I had a lot of friends who work on costume and jewelry, etc. The clothes she's wearing are also very class-defined. The jewelry also designates a certain caste-oppressed community in Goa. So there are very clear signifiers that tell you who and what she is. And she's looking directly at the camera, right? So again, very different than that first image you saw. Now, these are images from the cover of magazines, right? This is the Samaj Sudharak, from which the cover of my book comes as well. This is a journal that was started in 1929 and continues to this day, right? And it's published every single month. And these, now it's called the Gomantak, it was called the Samaj Sudharak, and every cover has an image of a woman doing something fucked up to Brahmins, right? Brahmins are our white people, we love to hate them. So this is, if you read Devanagari, it's a rock and she's kicking it and it says Rudi, which basically means tradition. So all of the images are, so in some ways you're looking at this and thinking, well, this is too easy. This is too liberatory. This is giving us every single script of feminist refusal that we want, but there's always something awry, right? So Now, that's the picture that you saw, and all of these pictures are very clearly staged. They're like headshots, right? Because this is also the 1940s, and these women are also performers and kalavans, artists. So they're also working in the Hindi film industry. The major singers from the community are major Hindustani musical singers from India that many of you would recognize, like Lata Mangeshkar, Andhra Bhosle, Mogubai Murdikar, if you follow classical music. These are again images. I'm just giving you a kind of variety of images so that you can see the difference of representation across the board. I have that image of the tennis player just because it's an aspirational form that appears. Nobody is playing tennis, but since I do, I wanted something. I was like, what the hell is that doing there? But why not, right? So I have that there for that reason. Give me 1 minute. I'll just hold this. It's easier. And then there are few images of domesticity that we see, and these images are always carefully staged without any masculine presence, right? And I say masculine because it's not about gender, it's about representation. But you see in the background the spinning wheel, which is again a reference, it's 1940 to Mahatma Gandhi, and you see a domesticity sans men, right? There are never any men in any images. And last but not least, this is a piece written by my father when he was 16 years old, and it says Amhi Kaun, and it's a queer kinship avant la lettre, where he basically says that if we are asked not to look for our biological fathers, because this is kinship outside of the nuclear family form, why are we being asked to love our biological mothers? Shouldn't we be allowed to choose who we love, right? So this is, again, another way to signal the kind of complexity of the archive. Now, as I said to you before, this archive contorts itself to accommodate genres of representation that we understand as requirements of veracity genres in archives, like testimonials, biographies. So this is one of the only biographies in the book, and I write about it in my first chapter, which is called Me Kaun, Who Am I? And it's built on a staged attack that the author stages on his own family and pretends that it's done by the Brahmins so that they can accrue rights and representation. And the reason why they do it is because the state does not understand oppression through sex labor as one that is something that can be recognized under the law, right? So what's really remarkable about this book is in the first volume, he describes this attack and doesn't tell us anything, and you hear about his wife fainting in fear, gunshots. It's a perfectly scripted drama, strategic drama. And then in volume 2, we find out that it was a staged attack. Now, everyone in the collectivity knows about the staged attack and thinks about it as a badge of honor. If you go to Lisboa, there is a case, the only case called Bhima versus the name of the Brahmin community, which was filed and is held up in Lisboa, from which this collectivity got schools and land, right? So on the one hand, the archive that you look at in the collectivity records this as a staged attack, and if you go to the official archives in Lisboa, it's recorded as an attack that actually happened that gave us rights and representation, right? So again, now this is just for you. Again, this is not in the book. This is a will, right? And again, a will is also a traditional genre. And most of the wills in this collectivity are not about property. They're about stories. So this is about a 20-page will where this woman, Magubai Shirodkar, has nothing really to give, but she uses the will to tell the story about all of her patrons and all of her children across the state of Goa so that you can track the genealogy of her kinship, right? So the will becomes a different kind of reproduction, which is not about normativity, but about something entirely different. Okay, now we're going to pause here, and I'm going to say a little bit more before we return to this image. Now, these archives are in 4 languages. They are in Kannada, Konkani, Marathi, and Modi, and Portuguese. Modi is, of course, an in-between language between Sanskrit and Marathi, and Kannada, which I don't know how many of you can read Kannada, but that Kannada is spoken in Karnataka and some other parts of South India, but it is also written in multiple scripts, not necessarily only in this script, right? So we'll get to this image because this image is also worth talking about. But before we get there, I want to say something else about the Samaj, which is very important for us to understand, which is their corruption of the endogamous structures of sexuality and gender that suture caste to power. Now, endogamy, as most of you know, and as my wonderful comrade Durba Mitra has so succinctly argues, founds colonial and post-colonial histories of society in South Asia, a violent structure of caste and conjugality that scaffolds sexuality into zones of domestic and patriarchal containment. You marry within your own caste, and that sustains the purity of your blood, right? Now, Mitra writes, to defy endogamy then is to excavate the sedimented genealogies of its emergence, to speak to its reliance on caste oppression and the management of female sexuality. Any refusal of endogamy poses challenges for a Hindu family form in which caste demarcates kin and conjugality determines access to property, inheritance, and livelihood. In bypassing the mandates of endogamy, so if you have children with a patron who is a Brahmin, that child is not a Brahmin, but that child is also not a Brahmin, because endogamy is both corrupted, but also somehow not fully diverted, right? So the history of the Samaj proffers a more radical or perhaps more chaotic caste narrative in which there is no fixed inherited origin and where caste histories are always threatening to dissolve. If endogamy preserves the reproduction of caste as an inherited form through conjugality, then the Samaj's history of itinerant sexuality and non-conjugal kinship makes the permanence of caste both anomalous and temporary. As I have written elsewhere, Samaj members maintained non-conjugal sexual and long-term relations with their upper caste Brahmin yajmans or patrons, birthed children who were given Brahmin surnames, all outside the prescribed parameters of endogamy and the Hindu family form. Such caste mayhem and breakdown can be seen in the regular ease with which Samaj members are often asked if they are original or fake Brahmins at various gatekeeping sites in Goa. So, for instance, during the course of my early archival work in Shiroda, which is a small village in southern Goa where my mother was born, that hosted the Samaj's first large political gathering, I was often accompanied by an elder from the Samaj, Sunita Chandavarkar. Chandavarkar, whose surname carries the distinctive stench of an upper caste lineage, facilitated my engagement with local authorities. At each encounter with priests or bureaucrats, she was repeatedly asked to explain the logic of her obviously Brahmin surname, especially given our connection to a Devadasi Samaj. Chandavarkar's weary response to such inquiries, uttered with mocking and measured irony, was always the same. Kam amze, now amze, khare ki kote, he kon tharonar. Our work, our name, who decides what is original or fake? Now, moving between the nominalizations of Dalit, other backward castes, open category in Maharashtra, Goa, and Karnataka, the Samaj's history thus speaks to the biopolitics of caste and sexuality as striated and pliable, less a place of certitude than a signature of persistent unverifiability, where the data for who qualifies as an oppressed caste remains porous, even arbitrary. Give me 1 second while I put this somewhere. Voila. To be clear, there is no equivocation around the brutalities of caste segregation, discrimination, and violence. So when I say something is unverifiable and striated, I do not mean that there is no caste violence or sexual violence. What remains less certain are the forms through which caste and sexuality are legislated and recognized. Such mediated caste knowledges undergird the very judicial categorizations of caste materialized in the languages of rights and representation, where we become data. I tick the box, OBC, other backward castes, that holds me in reserve as we cut across religion, language, and geopolitics. Now, in what follows, I'm going to provide two very tiny staged events of reading to give you something to hold on to before I close. Each an archival fragment of histories of caste, sexuality, evidence, and dissent, rendered in different rhetorical keys. So I want you to pay attention to the tenor. I began with a dramatic reading of a poem. I switched registers into archival invocation, and now I'm going to take you into another tenor to think about these archives. Now, each fragment that I'm going to talk about generates a different set of immanent critiques of caste and sexuality, ongoing refutations of clarity and categorization. My ambition, for better or worse, is necessarily diffuse, perhaps even didactic. The urgency here is to exude new idioms of the possible. In order to get to my non-data, you will have to use your imagination. Let's begin. We are all Saraswats, caste. Saraswat is a name for a category of Brahmins in the regions that I talk about. Now, we'll come to this image. September 2012. A small enclave of the Samaj lives in Hubli, Dharwad, Karnataka, a bustling border city between Maharashtra, Goa, and Karnataka. Here, members of the collectivity, approximately 450 families or so, are multiply categorized as Dalit, OBC, with a few subgroupings making their way out of lower caste classifications. As is the case with their counterparts in Maharashtra and Goa, the broader efforts of this group are dedicated to social and economic upliftment of their members. What remains relevant in these communities is their attention to a variegated and messy arena of reform and recognition. As such, I'm in Hubli to conduct archival research and to speak to some of the living elders who have wills, property deeds, and various historical memorabilia. On the invitation of a member of the Samaj Executive Council, Uday Badkar, I attend the monthly function held at the Samaj in the heart of Hubli. I'm just going to talk about this image in a second. Now, the function is a gathering of celebration and admonition. I've been to many of these as a child, as achievements of members are lauded, even as the continued social and economic destitution of the communities continues to be bemoaned. At this point, I'm pulled into the fray by an enthusiastic older devadasi, Nirmala Tai, who asks me to speak on my research and remind the audience of the Samaj's enduring history of sexuality. And she adds coquettishly, waving her finger at me, make sure to tell them, Namma Mahila Sundara Idaratara, how beautiful our women are. It is at this point that I noticed this very large banner displayed prominently above the stage, a banner written in Kannada which reads, Konkan Saraswat Samaj. Saraswat, remember, means Brahmin, right? So baffled at what I conclude is surely a mistake, or at least an aspirational typo, I turn to Nirmala Tai and ask her to explain the banner. Surely, I ask, in my best impersonation of a well-behaved historian, how will this appear in the archives mode? You must see how this looks. The banner, I add, suggests that we are a Saraswat Samaj, a Brahmin Samaj, which is clearly not true. Without batting an eyelid and with a weary nod, Nirmala Tai looks at me and says, do you see what it says next to the banner? And look at that point to the right, at the right. That is the image of the goddess Saraswati, the goddess of learning. In Hubli, in the Konkan region, we are devotees of Saraswati and committed to learning, and so we ourselves are Saraswats. That right does not belong to Brahmins. Bemused by Nirmala Tai's casual explanation of what appears to be rather imaginative leap of self-identification, I turn to Badkar, the Samaj trustee, and ask him the same question. His explanation, too, echoed, albeit with some difference, much of what Nirmala Tai had just referenced. Badkar patiently reminded me that the Hubli branch of the Samaj had deliberately chosen this name because they believed they had migrated from the mystical banks of the river Saraswati, and as such were her subjects. When pressed on the historical details of this claim, Badkar remains unfazed and stated that those details were not relevant because, quote, this is what we believe to be true. And in any case, if I had any further doubt about their legitimacy as a collectivity, he noted with great pride that even the dominant caste community in Hubri, the Chitrapur Saraswat Brahmin Samaj, had no choice but to respect their nominalization. With an ironic smile, he added, quote, "They have to accept us because their numbers are shrinking and we are here now." Such acceptance, Badkar reminds me, does not alleviate caste discrimination or segregation. It, however, does fissure proprietary upper caste claims to visibility and recognition. Now, there's clearly a lot more to say about this interlude of caste and sexuality and the historical record. After all, from what we have learned about the Samaj's history, such caste adjustments rarely materialize economic change, but they appear throughout in the ways in which the Samaj conjures its own histories of belonging. Caste becomes marked by dissolution, by the very annulment of its evidentiary forms. Regardless of how the Samaj narrates its own nominalization, we are Saraswats, its archival presence in the official archives will now always gesture to one Konkan Saraswat Samaj, legible for most data-driven research as a Brahmin community. After all, as a registered collectivity, the Samaj will now clog up the data stream, corrupting caste lineage as an inherited form. Let me be clear, such castes of hand, if you will, are not to be read as aspirational forms. There is no desire here for anyone to be Brahmin. Instead, the titular event comports more with the Samaj's broader epistemology, a pretext for a different history of caste, an installation of descent, a reordering of the grammar of recognition and lineage. The Samaj's self-dedicated name, Konkan Saraswat Samaj, hovering somewhere between ordained caste structures and imaginative refurbishment, between evidence and kala, art, becomes magically liberated from the more burdensome data machine, that stultifying apparatus of rights and representation. Instead, we get translations of sexuality and caste circulating in a continuous present that thwarts state demands for a compliant and intelligible history. The data has changed. Who's a Brahmin now? I'm almost done. Now, the second, I have last two tidbits, but let's stay on this one. This is called Hum Kagaz Nahi Dikhayenge. We will not show our papers. And I see many of you nodding because we all know this quite well. Even as protests against the controversial Citizenship Amendment Act, which was an act that was passed first at the end of 2019 till 2020, officialized much later. The last protest I attended was right before the pandemic in Maharashtra. This was a very important and controversial amendment because it sutured citizenship to evidence. You had to show papers that you were born in India, that you belonged in India, and of course most caste-oppressed minoritized communities do not have the virulent logic of evidence, right? So the prevailing ideology behind both state efforts was the systematic expulsion of minority Indian Muslim communities. So in order to become a citizen of India as an asylum seeker, if you were Hindu and potentially Christian, you had a chance, but if you were Muslim, no chance, right? And that continues to this day. So there were a lot of protests at the time. Now, meanwhile, Muslims would be required to prove their citizenship through spurious paper archives, which cannot be recognized. And there are many wonderful people like Rahul Rao who have written about this in more eloquent ways than I have. I want to turn to this story just to return to these questions of evidentiary regimes. The chant Hum Kagaz Nahi Dikhayenge, which literally means we will not show our papers, became, as many of us here know, a rousing anthem of the protests, echoing the challenges evidentiary regimes placed on bodies across regions, generations, and temporalities. Excerpted from Varun Grover's now viral poem, the full paragraph reads, हम संविधान को बचाएंगे, हम कागज नहीं दिखाएंगे, हम जनगण भी गाएंगे, हम कागज नहीं दिखाएंगे. We will save the constitution, we will not show our papers, we will sing the national anthem, we will not show our papers, right? So we refuse the demand. Now, for sexuality subjects, such a demand for evidence produced a particularly complex set of legal, ethical, and affective negotiations. The most strident refusals of such paper regimes were, of course, enacted by trans kin who spoke out against their continuous effacement within legal and societal structures in India. To produce evidence, original evidence of kagas, of paper, to prove, entre guillemets, trans lives, who we really are, scholars and activists insisted was to return to familiar legal and chronological structures of self that were violent and punitive. For Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi kin, and of course the segregations of caste and sexuality are clearly artificial, the call to documents, verifiable or otherwise, was an acutely exclusionary judicial enactment of caste consolidation. To be legible as paper subjects was to further dehumanize Dalit Bahujan bodies already at the peripheries of state's biopower. For example, my own mother, like so many other caste-oppressed kin in India, has no birth certificate, only a memory of a life nourished despite the mandate of that origin story. To refuse evidence was to forge a history of sexuality and caste that required new languages of political action. In a space like South Asia, where the idea of evidence is always already a hoax, anyone who has grown up in South Asia or anywhere in the global South for that matter understands that evidence is unreliable, right? That evidence is a hoax, and in India we would call it a flexible form, a jugaad. So what does it even mean, as we have seen through the history of the Gomantak Maratha Samaj, to both refuse, you understand that evidence is unreliable, but yet you mobilize it for rights and representation. This is not an agon, right? So the double bind that we're used to is we cannot not want rights. We know rights come through modalities like the law, which are corrupt. This is an anticipation of the double bind and mobilizing it towards rights that will suture representation to a kind of emancipatory politics, like the staged attack, right? I'm going to stage an attack because I know if I don't have an evidence of my oppression, I won't be recognized as oppressed. Right? So let me give you the script that you recognize. In doing so, I understand this agon not as a place of aporia, but as a place of possibility, right? So documents fake and fail lives. We know this. Their failure is an incitement to the variations of duplicity, duplication, and collectivity. Our pandemic times, and I'm sure most of us remember them quite vividly, further heightened these kagas regimes as citizens were both composed and jettisoned through a language of evidence that arbitrarily created insiders and outsiders. I have often returned to these early moments of dissent in these past few harrowing months as the jugaad form, and I wrote this when the pandemic was just about to not end, but see a different mode. I wrote this in the past harrowing months as the paper form had become both our salvation and our demise in South Asia. Social media secured life at the very moment in which the state refused the possibility. So people were looking for oxygen cylinders, etc., but if you were from minoritized communities, you would post on social media, and someone from your community would find a way to get you an oxygen mask or an oxygen cylinder because the state was unresponsive and because you were not recognized by the state as a citizen, right? So these kinship networks were how people survived. So social media secured life at the very moment in which the state refused its possibility. Unnamed kin died in unnamed spaces, even as the register of COVID-19 deaths and cases climbed up each day. A trans Dalit comrade in rural Maharashtra in Latur, where I work, who could not get their brother into a hospital bed, wrenchingly wrote me, "Kagas navte ग, म्हणून त्याचे मरण झाले." We didn't have the right papers, sister. That is why he died so prematurely. Okay, let me move to the last section before I release you from my abundance. I remember you. I remember you, my mother always tenderly says to my partner Lucy as she glimpses her across oceans, virtual and real, every week. I wrote this during the pandemic. My mother, a resolute Goan devadasi, who never took to living in Bombay, is 85. Her memory faded and folded into crevices of stories told and untold. Her world, a map of the everyday life of sexuality and caste, charts the realism of autofiction, where the past is always somewhere close at hand. In the pixelated landscape of my video screen, Ai's words linger, a translated rendering of how she manifests absence. I remember you is her English condensation of our shared Marathi phrase, Mala tuji आठवण येते, which makes आठवण, memory, an act of personal historicity, a poignant conjuring of past and present. I remember you too, Auntie, Lucy always responds, sealing a treasured ritual of long-distance love that sutures affect to a history of memory. To remember here is not to grasp a lost history or surrender to the nostalgia of a less violent past, if there ever was one, but more an aspiration of descent, to fashion a world, or at least a version of a world, that brings joy, andolan, succor, and the possibility of a reunion. I thought often of Ai's phrase during the pandemic as I traversed and traveled several times to Mumbai to see her without her beloved Lucy, whose US passport made it impossible for her to enter a virus-stricken India. I thought about what it means to remember a history lost and unseen in a country besieged by memory disputes, where little separates the factional from the functional. Unfortunately, this has become even more real today than it was in 2020 when I wrote, or 21 when I wrote this. Even as India buckled under the weight of rampant authoritarianism, casteism, and a general disregard for human life, I remember you. I remember the promises of liberation, the mandate to agitate, organize, and agitate. I remember the farmers' protests, the words of Nodeep Kaur, the joyous rhythms of Shaheen Bagh, and the refusals of Bhima Koregaon and Muskan Khan. Today, as heartbreak still stretches across India, for example, the recent inauguration of the Ram Mandir on January 22nd of this year, the very place where a mosque was desecrated and hundreds of Muslims were killed and communalism spread across India, where more fires are led and lit to cremate than to create, there are more memories to be made. From the searing faces of my Dalit Bahujan kin, who tended the dead in the crematoriums of Hindutva making, to the oxygen langar that provides breath to the as yet living, we remember. A cremator in Delhi, at the center of India's COVID hell, the byline reads, weeps. He is, after all, the only witness, the only record of the living dead, because Brahmins are not tending to the dead. Ashu Rai is his name, always a Dalit, yet now the bearer of last rites, of data unprocessed, of bodies unspoken. Quote, almost everyone asks me about my caste, because everyone wants a Brahmin to do the last rituals and not the Dalits. But the Brahmins aren't available, Rai says. We are. Drenched in sweat, bearing wood, he takes one remaining piece of cloth, covering his face and head, and whispers laughingly, quote, this cloth absorbs my sweat, and when I hang it on my shoulder, people think I am a Brahmin priest. I am a Dalit. I am the record of your loss. I am not your data. I am abundant. Towards dissent. Jai Bhim.
Thank you so much. Questions? I know my students have prepared questions.
I know you're sweating, so if you feel like you need to hydrate, please do. So.
Hi, I'm Rose. I am one of the students in the class.
I would never have guessed.
And I have like two different things for my question here because I was, yeah. So I have a question about the specific research position I found myself in, and I thought that you might have something interesting to say about this. But I also don't know how relevant this is going to be for everybody because I do ancient studies. So specifically, I study women in the ancient Mediterranean, and specifically within that, abortion, and other ways of pregnancy termination in that period of time in early Christianity in particular.
All uplifting questions.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I've run into this issue of archives and material evidence, or lack thereof in my research. So the number of writings preserved for women are proportionally way less than the writings preserved for men from that period of time. And abortion isn't directly written about, at least not all the time, at least not with the resources that I've had access to so far. So your book gave me like new ways of looking at narratives of abundance versus the paucity of material that have been really revolutionary for me. But this also made me think about the resistance that I've encountered from some mentors, not at USC, luckily, but at other institutions, about the possibility of even studying abortion and what I'm calling like pregnancy termination in the ancient world at all, because there's supposedly not enough of a record left by women to determine what this might have looked like. And sometimes these people are the ones who are really instrumental in helping me get access to an archive or access to like field work and something like that. And I guess I was wondering, how do you deal with other people, especially other researchers who are older and more advanced, telling you that maybe the archive isn't enough? And what advice do you have like for the grad students specifically trying to navigate these relationships? And not just about the archive directly, but also about like who mediates access to the archive, and who approves in quotes, one's work, especially if there's skepticism about the viability of one's project. Thank you.
That's a great question, and in some ways I would say you lie creatively about what you do. For example, I'm doing a new book right now on caste and indenture in the Indian Ocean, and I've just spent about 3 months in Mauritius, and I can't really tell anybody I'm working on caste and indenture, because caste is a very complicated question that's policed by the Mauritian state and the Indian state, which has a big presence. So I simply say I work on indenture, okay, which allows me to, and you have to have a good sense of humor and look, and have good hair, but can't help you with that, I'm joking. But I think the question you're asking is an important one, and it's a question that came up this morning in the theory workshop in a different iteration. And one of the things I would say is that this question can hover around questions of anachronism as well, right? Meaning that the questions you're asking are not relevant to the time, or you're bringing to bear kind of categories of analysis that are not really visible in the same time, right? So one of the challenges for all of us, and I think this continues to be a challenge for me, is how do we think about the ecologies of epistemological representation, right? Meaning, how does an object that you study accrue value? How does it get recognized as something having value? Now, this archive is a great example of that, right? It's been around forever, but nobody's worked on it. Everyone knows this collectivity. This is not some collectivity that is remote and unknown. These are very famous people, but because of the history of sexuality and because of its availability, nobody's worked on it, right? So the challenge, so when I first started doing this work, I remember I gave a talk, and some caricature of a white historian asked me a question. He said, Anjali, this is great, but the reason probably nobody's worked on it because it's a failed archive, right? And I thought, my impulse was to say something quite outrageously mean, but then I thought, well, this is actually a good question, right? Why does this person think, how does he accrue value? How does someone, and as feminists, but we bear the burden of that as well, as scholars who work on feminist questions, like you are, reproductive rights, and this is where the work of my dear friend Saba Mahmood is very important, right? Is how do we ask the questions we ask, right? And do we also look for certain liberatory scripts of archival presence, right? And that's what I was trying to write. This is not a community that you want to, it's not an iconic community in any way. It's a caste-oppressed community, but it does not proffer the fantasy of caste liberation. But that is precisely the point, right? You want to talk about the messy entanglements of caste and sexuality that do not render the story we want. Otherwise, we would all be Christopher Columbus, right? So the question I would say is for you to navigate your interests, not in the sense of I want to look at abortion because it's a question that no one has looked at, or because it's a question that people are too nervous, but I would say think about what are the questions people are looking at, right? And why are the questions you're interested in not accruing value? Is it simply because they are, interdits, they are you can't write about them, or is it something else, right? So I think one of the ways is to navigate that, and also and think about your own origin stories, right? That's why I said, the images are all, I could write about this as this fantastic, recovery project of this amazing community, et cetera, but to do that would then to reproduce the same thing all over again, right? So it's not really answering your question, but it's asking you to think about the epistemological ecologies through which we grant value to archives, right? And to think about, and periodization is also an important one, right? The early modern period, particularly in the regions you're looking at, has a certain, is also a place of efflorescence, right? All of the early queer stuff came out of early modern studies. I began as a Renaissance scholar. I started to work because that was the place where, but now everybody only writes about the present, right? So what does that mean? So I think navigating those questions of periodization in a non-exceptional way is important for you to think about. So I don't know if that's helpful.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll ask for my paycheck later. Okay. Yes, please, tell me your name.
I'm Yu, and I'm a PhD student in comparative literature. I'm also a professor of Canisters, and I actually prepared another question, but I did that in 1 a.m. yesterday, so I don't quite understand what I was writing. So I have another question to ask, which I think is quite related to the lesser moving parts of your presentation, and because that reminds me of a gossip about my undergraduate institution, which is in China. So one of our professors is American. She tries to get her partner to get into China to work with her with a partner visa. But the thing is that China does not, at least mainland China does not recognize homosexual marriage. So that her partner was refused to get a visa because the Chinese ambassadors just don't believe that she's going to.
Quite.
They don't understand this, and she was from Philippines, the partner of my professor, and they believe that she was trying to work because Philippines was economically less privileged than mainland China for now. And that goes to another question, that there's something, for example, the policies or that everything could be written into archive that is not translatable between different cultures. For example, it is impossible to write about this history, this story in a Chinese archive, because there does not exist something like homosexual marriage in China. And thus, I wonder when you're working on the archive and you're working on the archive of, sorry, I still can't pronounce the name, but it's unprivileged Samaj in Goa, which is a Portuguese India, which has different language systems, and also mentioned create the necessity of creating a new grammar, creating a new lexicon to make use of the abundance of the archive. But the question I have is that how do you think that we should translate our own grammar or our own lexicon into, for example, the academia that we are in dialogue with? For example, in the case that I mentioned, if we are writing this kind of story or this kind of stories about how homosexual marriage is not recognized in China, how queer history is not recognized in China, if there is not even the idea of homosexual marriage or queer in China, in the lexicon of Chinese. I don't know.
Yeah, I think I get a sense of what you're asking. I would say that there are plenty of people, you're fortunate in Sinophone studies, who are writing about these questions. I can think about several. Howard Chang is one of them. There's a wonderful book on Chinese marks, which talks about this question of translation. I've forgotten the first name, the last name is Liu. Petrus, I always call him Peter. So Petrus, there's a lot of Taiwanese scholars writing about this. So I think this is a question that, is one that has plagued questions of geopolitics for quite some time, right? Which doesn't mean that it's not important, but the good news for you is that you have a long reading list where people have been talking about this, right? So the question has been moved away from the portability of categories, meaning, the word homosexual doesn't translate and carry the same weight in Chinese because there isn't a word, if it's Mandarin or Cantonese, that has the same valence, right? So what do we do with that? And I think that's what the suggestion of this book is as well, is to think about geopolitics as an epistemology, meaning as a place from where we ask questions rather than you take questions to the place, right? So I would invite you to, to read the work of people much more learned than I am, on particularly in the question of PRC and Taiwan, and look at the ways in which they are thinking of those questions. But yes, it's a good comment.
Hi, I'm Sarah, second year comparative literature PhD student, also in Ritu Khanna's class. So a central question that frames your book is, quote, what would histories of sexuality look like if interrogated as histories of regions and or areas, end quote. How difficult was the process of answering this question, especially as a history of sexuality approach presumably derives from Foucault and Western historicism? Or did you draw from other approaches? Also, do you think that we can make claims about the history of sexuality beyond a particular area or on a macro scale? Or do you think that this is inevitably going to be problematic or lead to failures in apprehension? And if so, in what ways?
Okay, that's a lot of questions. I'll try to answer one. I think that the simple answer is that this isn't a history of sexuality about a place. It's a history of sexuality that is possible because of a place, right? Which goes to the question that was asked before, right? So that's why I've spent the last 20 years arguing to whoever will have the patience to listen, is that geopolitics is an epistemology and not an exemplar, right? So if something is a history, if sexuality is a history of a region, it means that how we ask questions about an area are constituted through histories of sexuality, right? And if you look at the history of anthropology or histories of how the idea of alterity is studied, they're mostly annexed through this idea of sexuality, right? So in many ways, as I say in the book, this book is not about the Samaj. It is about a question that was made possible because of the archives of the Samaj, right? So this is, if you've waded through my endnotes, I do a lot of work to create a citational public. So you have forms of reading that see Foucault not as the origin story, but as axiomatic to the questions we ask, which is very different. So when something is axiomatic, it is ordinary, but not always the place of movement, right? So there are lots of different people that I cite and think with, and sexuality is not always attached to identitarian politics, right? So that's why this book is not about gay people, it's not about trans people, it's about non-reproductive epistemologies, right? Which is a queer project. So I think, what does it mean to think about region? All right, so how do you think about the Indian Ocean, right? As a geography of affiliation, but that's not always about unification. But it could be about disruption or messiness. It's not about gathering, but about laying asunder. So I think that's kind of what I was starting to think about. And again, I said this morning, nothing I'm saying is particularly original, right? Everything I'm saying keeps company with many other people who've been making these arguments. And I think what I'm trying to do is remind us all together that these questions have always been there, right? But we have chosen to look away or chosen to not recognize the question as having value, like the archives of the Samaj. Why haven't people written about it, right? Because they do not cede to our economy of value, right? So you should think about, well, when you think about histories of area, entre guillemets, right? Why do we not read a history of sexuality as constitutive when you study the area? Right? Or if you think about comparative literature, which, my training is in literature and history, when you think about languages, why do we not provincialize the idea of language, right? So you could be multilingual, but if you speak English, French, and Portuguese, you're multilingual in a very hegemonic way. You're not really multilingual, you're monolingual, right? So that's also a history of region. So it's not just about sexuality, it's about sort of interrogating again our habits of learning, right? And how we unmoor ourselves from those habits of learning. And as I keep saying, we live in a time, right? We are witnessing, as I said this morning, a genocide for which we have plenty of evidence. No one here will deny that there is a surfeit of evidence What more do we need to see? What more do we need to learn to understand that the history of a region is a history of violence? But yet we are not seeing, right? Why? Because our habits of learning are attached to certain places of value in which to criticize a certain political identity is to criticize a certain religious form. And we are not doing that, right? And you notice how much care I'm taking not to say certain things because I'm on the campus of a privatized university. That is also a history of region. Yeah? Yes, please. Tell me your name.
Hi, I'm Rinki, and I am also PhD first year. So my question relates to, it's a question about affect, and I'm always struggling to think about the place of affect in the sphere of political rights, and I'm also struggling to always define for myself how exactly I might.
You have me too, you don't need me.
Yeah, no, that's so I'm just going to read out.
Please.
I was really interested in a passage from Coda where you detail a conversation between your mother and Lucy and write about a long-distance love that sutures affect to a history of memory. I'm thinking about this framing of affect, memory, and history, and wondering what possibilities it might offer to us. I'm thinking here particularly of minoritarian fiction, specifically historical fiction, or the movement against 377 that depend upon the past to trace a linear continuum where the minority figure, for instance the queer individual, is seen as having always existed in order to legitimize their existence across time. This scripting within nostalgia and loss seems to be significant to political movements in South Asia, including CAA and 377. If this framing and activist gesture is a response to the evidentiary regime that governs the social, what might an alternate politics look like? And how might affect as a tool counter the logic of the regime? And how might we use abundance in the interest of other